Run. Are you going to do cut and stuff like that?
Yeah, so we're just starting streaming now. So
excellent, right. So welcome everybody. Welcome to Edinburgh. Welcome to our first webcast of this academic year. I'm delighted to welcome you all to BCS Health and Care Scotland. We are a small charity, and part of our mission is to ensure that IT is beneficial to society, and we have a range of resources. Please come and visit our website for further information. This morning or this afternoon we'll be talking about strategies and stratagems, and Rosemary here is going to talk about, ask the question whether it's all about human factors. Rosemary will just wait a few more minutes because we have a note from our sponsors. Please come and address our audience.
How's everybody doing? Good? I just wanted to let you guys know that we will be hosting a medical visualization hackathon. So it's going to run from November 2nd to the 5th, and we'll have a range of clinicians and people from the wider tech community come together and try to innovate ideas surrounding mainly precision medicine, but all areas of health and improved clinical pathways. So you're all invited if you'd like to come. We'd love to have you. Thank you.
And again, thank you very much for the company who is supporting us this afternoon. Delighted to welcome Dr. Rosemary Foster here this afternoon for our first talk. Rosemary is currently residing in Canada, and she made the long journey to come and talk to us today. She works for eHealth as a manager for community and primary healthcare programs, and prior to this post, she headed the eHealth Strategy and Policy Division at the South African Medical Research Council. She has a wealth of knowledge, and I'm delighted to welcome Rosemary. Rosemary, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you. So I've titled this Strategies and Stratagems. And what I'm going to do is first take you through my concept of strategy and some of the work I've done in that. And then we'll look at how strategies might fail or why they might fail. And then lastly, look at stratagems, which are what I call divisive behavior within organizations that can bring down strategies or prevent them from being executed. So a strategy, was used in a military sense, and it's a high-level plan for achieving a goal or one or more goals within a set of constraints. And nowadays it's applied quite broadly. It's a high-level plan, or it could be a hybrid of a high-level plan and a sort of framework for execution and architecture. And in eHealth, it's used in both ways. So when we talk about the hybrid in eHealth, then they call it a blueprint for eHealth or a framework for eHealth, but it will have more than just the strategy. It has a lot of the actual detailed implementation in it. So in 2012, I'm sure most of you have seen this because it's now quite some time ago, but the World Health Organization and ITU published this toolkit for developing a national eHealth strategy, and it came in 3 parts. The first part is to develop a eHealth vision. The second part, developing a national eHealth action plan, and the last part, a plan for monitoring and evaluation of the strategy. So it's a practical guideline for governments and their relevant ministries and departments for developing a vision, action plan and monitoring framework for eHealth. But although it's called an eHealth strategy toolkit, what you get out of it at the end is not an eHealth strategy. There's no document that comes out of that. What I found was that actually the vision document that comes out of part 1 corresponds most closely to what I define as a strategy. So there are 9 steps towards developing this vision. Managing the process, engaging with stakeholders, establishing strategic context, learning from trends and experience, drafting a blue sky, unconstrained strategy, identifying required components, gathering information about environment, assessing gaps and opportunities, and refining and communicating the strategy to the relevant stakeholders and people who would actually implement it. So this is something that you may have seen before because it's a favorite example of mine, but 100 years ago at Vimy Ridge, the Canadian forces were instructed to take Vimy Ridge from the Germans, and so this solid line is where the Germans had been for 2.5 years, since October 1914, and the solid blocks of color are the 4 Canadian divisions. And the mission or the vision was to take that line, and the mission was how they were going to do it. So just running through those 9 steps again very quickly, the process managed by experts who know what they're talking about, engaging with stakeholders, establishing the strategic context, because the Germans had been there for 2.5 years, they had really dug in, they had hardened defenses and so on. Learning from trends and experience, and here is General Byng of the Canadian Forces, and he's inspected what I think is a howitzer captured or taken from the Germans. The blue sky strategy I don't think really applied in this case because there was really no option. They had to do it. So they couldn't say, well, let's all just go back and lie on Kitsilano Beach in Vancouver. So identifying required components, they need weapons, ammunition, and so on, gathering information on the environment. They also did trench raiding at night. They have little sorties where they would harass the enemy, and then in that find out more about what was happening. And assessing gaps and opportunities. Now the ground there was very porous but stable, sort of limestone or chalky, and so it was really suited to building these tunnels. And one thing they did that was different was that they communicated the strategy right down to the lowest level. So instead of the men being just sent over the top without knowing why or when, or they were actually told what the plan was. And so on the 9th of April, they actually did successfully take Vimy Ridge. And one thing, the strategy doesn't include the details of implementation. So it says at 0 hours, we leave our assembly trenches and push forward as soon as possible. The whole idea being to get into no man's land before the barrage starts. Before the Hun barrage starts. So they didn't say, this is how you must lay your sandbags, and this is how deep you should dig, and this is what the trenches should look like. That was left to the experts in the field. And so this is an example of a very successful strategy. So having taken that diversion, I've now converted you to my understanding of an eHealth strategy. In 2013, I then wrote a paper where I looked at the South African eHealth strategy because I had led the process of developing that, and how it compared to the guidelines in the WHO ITU toolkit. And as a result of that, the WHO then contacted me a couple of years later, and things take time, and they asked me to develop a descriptive and normative framework for characterizing country eHealth strategies. I'll just get back to my notes here. And they wanted it tested on 5 strategies and then fine-tuned, and then wanted a complete assessment on strategies for up to 30 COIA countries. Now, COIA stands for Commission on Information and Accountability for Women and Children's Health, and that commission was in existence from 2011 to 2015. But there were 74 countries that were on this list, and they could, I suppose, correspond to low middle income countries. So I reviewed as much as I could the literature that would give me some idea of what an ideal ICT or eHealth strategy would look like, and try to determine the features that I would be assessing. And I developed the pilot assessment tool. So very quickly, there's a lot of print on here, but I found that the World Bank had published something in 2012, and really they said a strategy should tell you should establish the as is, so you look at current state and so on, and then you establish the to be, which is where you want to be, and then you describe how you're going to get from your as is to your to be. And that was my first one. Then I looked at the WHO ITU toolkit, and what content they said should be in the vision, and what foundations for change should be included in that. So they talked about establishing a strategic context for eHealth, which looks at the actual health status of the country, what population health is, what the status of the health system is, and then what the vision is for eHealth going forward. Then I have 2 colleagues, Maurice Mars and Richard Scott, and they had written a really nice paper in 2013 where they described steps towards the formulation of an eHealth strategy. And they talked about evidence gathering and assessing the situation. What I liked about theirs was that they recommended a holistic view. So looking at the health status, the actual burden of disease in the country, looking at the current status of the health systems, the deficiencies, the problems, challenges, and then the readiness of the country for eHealth, identifying possible solutions based on the country's unique issues, and prioritizing solutions based on burden of disease, risk level, costs, and resource availability, and then selecting certain or prioritizing solutions, and then creating an action plan. And their criteria for a good strategy was that the concepts would be simplified so that all stakeholders across the board would understand what's in there, not just the people who would implement it. And eHealth presented as an essential tool for healthcare delivery, not sort of a supportive thing on the side. And again, what I liked was they talk about needs-based and pragmatic and best solutions for most pressing problems, and evidence-based, but not over-researched, because you need to just get to the heart of the matter. And then they talk about leveraging opportunities and sharing costs with other sectors. And in low and middle income countries, that's particularly important. So if you're putting out infrastructure for education and schools, then why not coordinate that with the clinics that are close by and so on. And they talk about integral solutions, so where there are components that it's not only infrastructure but components that are in common with other domains, like if you are identifying your population, you're creating unique identities, that may be your home affairs or whatever you call that, that you would then work with them and share that application or part of that application. And they said a long-term focus, but looking at specific targets that are short and medium term. And then Carl Strickman also wrote the eHealth Strategies report, and again, you can see the common things coming out of it now: cross-sector collaboration, governance, infrastructure, involving stakeholders, training, education, evaluation and impact assessment. And then finally I found this SAGAR, and I don't know if anyone has come across this. It was design, the influence of Ipsos design in the process of convergence of eHealth strategies at European level. And so the focus here is really on looking at interoperability, but how do European eHealth strategies converge in terms of interoperability? And so the S is for syntax and semantics. How common is that? Architecture, governance, applications, and the regulatory framework. So it's actually, I found that things were converging nicely. And finally, I came across this taxonomy for ICT strategies that I thought applied really nicely to eHealth, where you have a supportive or independent strategy that really it can, so eHealth would function in the way of making data available or helping, but not be involved in the actual business of healthcare. And then technological or policy support, where eHealth is actually helping the organization can actually formulate a plan based on policy, but underpinned by eHealth. And then finally, the aligned or fully integrated strategy is one where the country strategy for health actually includes eHealth, so it's kind of built on that, so they become one in a way. And I see that as sort of a move along maturity. So I finally settled on 11. This was working in conjunction with the people at WHO. We settled on 11 categories. So we have these description, the context, scope, goals, priorities, assessment of current state, governance, planning, financing and investment, foundations, legal and regulatory frameworks, services and applications, workforce, and monitoring and evaluation. So basically covered a lot of things that came up in the review. And within each one of these, and I'm not going to go into all that detail, but there are between 2 and 7, I suppose, statements that say this strategy does this, this, and this. And there would be 2 to 7 indicators within each of these categories. And then the scoring. So at first, we thought, well, we'd do a Boolean thing. We'd say, yes, they do it, no, they don't do it. But that didn't fit very well. So we thought perhaps the Likert type scoring, so where we'd say we strongly disagree is 1, we strongly agree is 5. But so we used this during the pilot assessment, and it seemed that we were actually scoring the strategies as good or bad, which in fact is not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to say this strategy is better than that one. We merely wanted to assess them in terms of these components. And so we finally scored them as 0 is not evident, 1 is partly evident, and 3 is fully evident. And so there's an example for Zambia for monitoring and evaluation. The strategy proposes a framework for monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of the strategy. So yes, it is fully evident. And then I made some comments. There's a separate section on monitoring and evaluation. And the proposed monitoring and evaluation framework will be directly linked to the strategic goals of the strategy. Yes, that was fully evident. So in this instance, Zambia seemed to have covered all of that. Here is another one, the foundations. So foundations for Belize, the strategy includes plans for infrastructure components where relevant. That was fully evident. The strategy addresses the adoption of relevant standards. Well, it was partly evident because lack of standards was addressed, but there was no reference to eHealth standards other than they said they need standards for personal identifiers, so it was limited. And then there was nothing for strategy indicates necessary governance mechanisms and structures and so on for adoption of standards, and so there they scored 0. And then there were also some free text in there where we just recorded the key decision makers endorsing the strategy are the president of the country, the deputy minister of health, or whoever that was. And the strategy is written in this language. And the strategy can be found, because actually this is a critical thing. If you have stakeholders and you can't find the strategy, it's not accessible, then it's kind of worthless. That was tested, and it is applicable for these dates. In the case of this one, it had expired, but I gave them a year or so. So finally, of the Koya countries, there were 20 that had eHealth strategies, and 12 were in English, and 8 in other languages. So the WHO had 3 translated, and so I was able to assess 15 Koya countries, and then I added 11 other countries. And so here are the results where the red or orange is non-Koya and blue is Koya. And it's actually quite interesting that the blue ones seem to stand out, but there's no competition here. So in the subsequent slides, I won't use color. So just going to run through these very briefly, and if you do want to have a further look, I can show you. So that was context, scope, goals and priorities, the assessment of current state, governance, planning, finance and investment, foundations. So I just took you through the criteria for foundations, legal and regulatory framework, services and applications. So this is interesting because it shows you that the strategies were really about what are we going to implement, and focusing on the technology and the IT part of it, and so most of these are 100% workforce and M&E. And then just a very brief discussion. The ones that were most thoroughly covered were services and applications, foundations, and monitoring and evaluation. And those that were least thoroughly covered were context, assessment of current state, and governance. So you can see that there's a gap. So there it is again. You can see these are the most thoroughly covered. Assessment of current state was the worst, which actually you should do that. And then if I just go back to, well, if you recall, there were some that had 0 scores. And one example is workforce. So Italy and New Zealand showed low and 0 scores for workforce. And I thought about that, and it may just be that countries are at a different maturity level for eHealth, are not worrying about that, the capacity thing, as much as a country like South Africa might be worrying about it. I don't know that, I haven't tested it, but and then also there may be some countries that do the sections in a separate document. And I know that Scotland had finance in a separate document. I don't know if it's still the case, but there was a separate thing for finance. Yeah. And so to the next part, how could a good strategy fail? Because there are many good strategies there, and but we're not really seeing this miracle. And so I've drawn on this tech ladder. It's from Kim Vicenti. I've adapted it a bit. And really, it goes from the level of policy, laws and regulations down to corporate culture, staffing, organizational structure, authority, responsibilities, chain of command in the actual service line, so on the shop floor in your team, and then information content structure, information flows, workflows, and then right down to the shape and location material, so you know, the real sort of basic ergonomics, I suppose. And the human factors at the top level are the things that I think affect implementing an eHealth strategy would be politics, social values, political connections, having what I call the wrong motives, or, you know, having, and then how can this impact the eHealth strategy? So if there's political upheaval, the change of government, new ministers in South Africa, we have now had 7 ministers of communication in 7 years. And that is really difficult to work with. So you get the removal of champions. You may find you're working with the deputy minister or someone who's really like buying in, and then suddenly the cabinet shuffles and they're gone. And then eHealth policies and strategies seem to me not to be mandates, but they're more nudges. So they're not saying, thou shalt do it. It's like, you think about this, maybe you should do this. It's very sort of gentle. And often there's no sustainable budget, and there's a lack of ownership. And then on the next level, how is leadership exercised and how is leadership perceived? So this is the level of upper management, I think, and even it's mainly upper management, some middle management, but there's power games. There's empire building, incompetency, the lack of domain level understanding, lack of buy-in, and Dunning-Kruger effect. And I'm speaking from personal experience. I've been in the field for a couple of decades now. Then when we get down to the actual shop floor, you know, how do we live and work in teams and groups, and how do we communicate, and how are we treated by our managers? And here are the things that can impact the strategies. We may lack shared goals, or the communication that comes from the upper level is communicated poorly by the leadership level, and so we're not quite sure what's going on. And managers build siloed power bases, which could be based on lack of confidence or lack of skills, competency, and lack of trust. And so I think that this is the area that actually needs looking at, because this is where it breaks down in those three. And so the WHO ITU toolkit has these 7 building blocks, and the stars are again where I think human factors really, it's the same stuff from the previous slide that will bring you down. And this is from the ISO Technical Report 14639, which I was very fortunate to be part of the task team that developed this. But the column on the right-hand side, again, this is where human factors will prevent your strategy from being implemented. So it's in executive sponsorship, national leadership, standards adoption, financing, performance management. And this is a bit about the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with limited experience must overestimate their ability. And I'm sure you've heard this before. What's so difficult? Put a camera and an iPad on a trolley or a cart, and that's telemedicine or whatever. What are you worrying about? And then I think there's something it's like a role confusion, because there's this blurring of technology and medicine. So here the doctor says, I'm your biological tech support specialist, but is it really the doctor? And the other one says a pacemaker for your heart, but you can download apps for your liver, kidneys, lungs, and pancreas. But the thing I'm really getting at here is that I think there's like a kind of a shine that we get from working close to this life and death stuff that maybe makes us think we're more important or something, because why do we tolerate what banks or engineering won't tolerate? Why do things work in the banking system and they don't work for us? That's what I'm really looking for. Yeah. And finally, stratagems. So stratagems are, I suppose, divisive ways of making sure your own agenda is pushed. And I've seen a lot of this. And so I've got a few examples of stratagems here. So delay, confound, obfuscate. Just muddy the waters. Don't answer emails. Maybe it'll go away. I won't make a decision. It's eventually something's going to sort of change. And you know, hazy processes. Who has the authority to make decisions? Or the opposite thing is like playing by the book. Say, no, this is what the standards document says. We can't do it differently. Or allowing exceptions. Or change control boards, program management officers that just push paperwork, and people are saying, well, we're not allowed to do that because of this. Or they say, we only use vendors for support and maintenance. We don't do our own support and maintenance. But there's a million of these. We only use open source, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Or open source is a bad idea and it's unsustainable. Or the doctors don't want to do any more pilots. They have pilotitis. There has to be a phased approach, or it has to be a big bang. This has never been taken to scale. Delay, delay, delay. Perhaps the funding will be pulled and then we don't have to worry about it. Oh, it's not in the spec. This is scope creep. Or if we've adopted agile methodology, we can add this. The clinical working group wants it this way. Or only top management may speak to the vendors. But it's the deputy minister's pet project, so it must take priority, no matter how silly it is. The doctors will never adopt this. The consultant we hired to do this did a terrible job, and now we've lost the funding. Blame. There are patient safety, patient privacy, patient confidentiality issues. We can't do that. And I've worked with a lot of doctors, and then people are confident, they're expansive, and they have a shared vision, and then they think in terms of us everywhere forever. So that's something I'd like to research further. And so finally, getting back to Vimy Ridge, I had to ask myself, if we had stratagems out there in the trenches, and someone saying, General Bing's strategy be blowed. I fought at Talana Hill that in the Boer War. You can't teach me anything. We'll do it this way. No. I don't think they'd have ever taken Vimy Ridge. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes for questions. Anything from the floor? I know that people on the webcast were asking about the availability of the slides, and we'll make sure that the PDFs are available on the BCS Health and Care Scotland after this presentation. Claudia, please, and if you can just repeat the question.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, and thanks again for your wonderful contribution to our MSc in Global eHealth over the years we've been running, and we look forward to continuing that relationship with you. I thought that was a really good overview of some of the challenges here, and it was great to draw on your experience there over, as you say, about 20 years, and having seen it all, really makes a difference. I wondered if you had any comments, and you sort of touched on this to some extent, but whilst we're not obviously in Africa and not seeing quite as much change happening so quickly, we nonetheless, in the way in which our government works, Scotland, England, in general, with reshuffling and so forth, we find people that have developed expertise in a topic or have bought into it or begun to shape it are quickly moved to other roles that somebody else takes on. Well, that is quite good in terms of enriching governments and leaders' involvement in eHealth, because you might get several of them, but on the other hand, it loses some of that investment. What advice would you have to the Scottish Government, for example, on maintaining this role as a continuous process and on building strategy upon strategy?
Well, I think the important thing is really recognizing the domain as a distinct domain. So you would be a specialist in something and certified. I don't know if this is answering, but you wouldn't be just moved because you could also do something else. You would be actually an eHealth specialist. But if you're talking about champions who are sort of like at leadership level, I really don't know the answer to that, because often people who are champions are also people who are going to contribute to something else in the same, like, high quality way. So it is a problem.
I would argue it's a problem as such, or actually it can be a problem, but the way I look at it presents also lots of opportunities to bring fresh thoughts or different points of views and experiences to different strategies. Otherwise, you wouldn't change the way you are, the direction you are moving towards. So it's a way to bring new thoughts.
That's a good comment. Thank you. Paul, can I get your question? If you can just repeat the question. So
I'm
people
sorry, yes, yeah.
Thank you, Rosemary. So my question's about the evaluation component. You paired it up with monitoring, and in many cases, for many strategies and the projects that deliver those strategies, monitoring is part of the governance of the implementation. But from my experience, governments, and we're talking about national strategies now, governments and the politicians that work in government are very averse to evaluation of the delivery of what they promise to deliver in the strategy. They don't like evaluation in most terms. So I'm wondering, you put the two things together, but from your experience and your reviews of the many strategies, the national strategies you looked at, how many of them actually had end-of-life evaluation as we know it built in? And was there any resistance from politicians to having that scrutiny of their delivery of what they promised to do?
So how many of the strategies had actually an end-of-life monitoring or evaluation? I would say none of them did. None of them actually had a complete plan for monitoring and evaluation. They recognized it as an important component and something that would have to be implemented once the work coming out of the strategy started. So, but there were instances where they would say, if you're committing to do certain things, then there must be a mechanism to actually track whether you're doing it and whether you're doing it on time and in budget and so on. And so there was some very high level reference to that, but not not a detailed plan, and nothing in terms of the actual end, how you would evaluate it at the end of the line. It's a very tricky thing. The South African eHealth strategy was 2012 to 2017, so it's expiring now, and very little has been done that was actually in there. But there's been no process running that says, well, how well are we doing? And I think people are averse to it because it's embarrassing.
Last question, please, Kimia.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, for a very insightful presentation on implementation of the World Health Organization Global eHealth Strategy. I would like to ask you a question about your experience of research. Would you distinguish specific clusters or groups of countries in terms of similar patterns or distinctive patterns in implementation of eHealth strategy based on either income group or geographical proximity or more perhaps sophisticated characteristics?
Yes, definitely. There's a continuum of maturity, I would say, and there are countries that have had a head start or have the resources and so on. And then there are countries like Zambia or Kenya that are just starting. So they're very different. What was interesting was that there were 3 of the lower middle income country strategies scored really well, but they'd been done by outside consultants, so that they were very good, but the countries didn't have the means to actually implement them. So that there's definitely a divide.
Is there one question on the live stream?
So, question from Derek. He says, wonderful presentation, thank you. And then he asks, I noticed standards is one of the assessment dimensions. Can the digital health strategy be separated from the national norms and standards as we did in RSA?
Do you want the question repeated?
Can the?
So he says, I noticed standards is one of the assessment dimensions. Can't the digital health strategy be separated from the national norms and standards as we did in RSA?
Can this strategy be separated from national norms and standards as it was in South Africa? In South Africa, we developed a normative standards framework document for eHealth, and it was a separate thing. So the strategy would say, establish a standards board, adopt standards, and the normative standards framework was actually one of the parts of the strategy that was implemented. So it came out of that. It's not in there. It's something it's part of the plan. But you wouldn't dictate which standards. It's the same as you wouldn't say how deep to dig the trenches.
Lovely. Thank you again, and let's show our appreciation for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.